Thanks a lot, Peter, and I want to parrot Peter's remarks and thanking everyone for being here. It's a great turnout. I know it's an ugly day, but it's a great day every day to be talking about emerging technology and regulation and innovation. So thank you for being here. And special thanks to the Capitol Hill chapter, who's agreed to co-sponsor this event with the Regulatory Transparency Project of the Federalist Society. Thank you very much. Should I hold this a little higher? Great. And so the Regulatory Transparency Project, I've described many times before as being the tip of the spear for discussions and analysis of the administrative state as it pertains to the development of a new innovation, the unlocking of opportunity for Americans around the country, and for the Federalist Society, and that's in part what this event is all about. Is how we can unlock those opportunities and how we can unleash American ingenuity and innovation in the country as it pertains to technology and transportation. But the Regulatory Transparency Project touches on a lot of regulatory areas, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity to take a look at our website, which is regproject.org, where we discuss the many different areas that we study, and where we put out a lot of our content. Some of the stuff that you might have seen ahead of this event. So some videos on flight sharing, a podcast that we've done on autonomous vehicles. Some of the folks who appeared in those videos and those podcasts will be here today. It's a fantastic lineup that we have speaking to you today. So very happy to have you here. I would be remiss if I didn't make a quick plug for a couple of other events that we have. It may not be of interest to you, but maybe your colleagues are interested. On the papers that were on your seats, there are a couple of events that we're hosting. One next week, very soon, Tuesday at the National Press Club, is looking at race and sex regulation and whether or not Asian American applicants are being barred at some of the elite colleges and universities around the country. The speakers there are on your pamphlet. And then also on June 1st, the Regulatory Transparency Project is going to be co-hosting an event at Antonin Scalia Law School, which is the 6th annual Public Policy Symposium on the Law and Economics of Privacy and Security. So hopefully you or a colleague or friend is interested, and I thank you for sharing that stuff. And so now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, over to Gregory Mcneill, who is a professor of law and public policy at Pepperdine University, and also serves as the chairman of the Regulatory Transparency Project's Emerging Tech Working Group for the Federalist Society. But before I do, I want to set the stage a little bit for what we're talking about today. I know it's not anything new for the folks here, but I was just reading recently, and it came to my mind that I might mention this as the foundation for today's event. In the early 1780s, Benjamin Franklin was in France after the Revolutionary War was over. He spent a little extra time there, and he had the opportunity to see the first balloon flight, the first unmanned and manned balloon flight in the early 1780s. And the French went wild over these flying devices. But the haughty English had much disdain for these things. They saw no reason why anyone would want to go into these balloons. There's no purpose for doing it. And at one of these air flights, one of these balloon flights, a spectator asked Benjamin Franklin, what is the reason? What is the use for one of these things? And he famously replied, what is the use of a newborn baby? I think that really gets at what we're trying to discuss here in terms of innovation and how regulators and legislators and their staffs can either be a hindrance to the growth of newborn technologies or can actually cultivate those and nurture those into being great innovations over time. Of course, if we're not smart about things, we can unfortunately prevent many of those things from ever appearing. And then, of course, if we're not smart also about how those innovations grow, those babies can turn into Amy Schumers. But of course, we can always deport those to Canada if we need to. But in any event, that's all I wanted to say. That I think lays the foundation for much of what the actual experts here will be discussing. Greg Mcneill and his team here. Thanks.
Just want to echo Devin's points with thanking all of you for coming out today. This project, the Regulatory Transparency Project, didn't originally have a working group on emerging technology. And so I think back to, it was early 2016, I think it was the night of the Iowa caucuses, and I was at dinner with Gene Meyer, the president of the Federalist Society, and I had this idea that I wanted to propose to him. And my idea was basically that the Federalist Society's practice groups, while being domain specific, lacked a practice group that dealt with cross-cutting topics in innovation or in emerging technology. So, for example, when you think of we'll just take Uber and Lyft, for example, you might look at that as an administrative law problem, or you might see it as a con law problem, and it would fit into one of those practice groups, or it might be some type of problem with privacy and security, or maybe it's a labor and employment group problem. And it's great that that particular company or innovation finds its way into each of those practice groups. But what's missing is a cohesive focus on the part of the Federalist Society on addressing issues related to emerging technology and how law, and derivative from that, regulations and government and courts are treating emerging technology. And underlying that, and part of our conversation was that, when you look at the arc of human history over the last 100 years, certainly in the last few decades in the United States, almost all of human progress, that which has lifted people out of poverty, that which has provided them greater life benefits, has come from new technologies and new innovations, right? So it hasn't come from government programs. We're lifting people out of poverty by providing new jobs for them, by having ways for them to work, by having ways for them to enter the economy. And emerging technology has been a huge driver in that. And we as a society, we're not focusing on it. And so I felt really strongly that we needed to have a special group focused on this. And so the Emerging Technology Working Group was formed. The way I came to that conclusion, just to, as some of you saw in my bio and in the invitation, in addition to be a professor of law and public policy, I'm also the co-founder of a software company in the drone space. And everything I thought about government that I heard from my one or two unicorn libertarian professors was amplified when becoming a business person who had to interface with a heavily regulated industry. And I saw in so many instances where my thoughts that an agency or Hill staffers would treat a certain issue in a particular way ran into embedded assumptions and equities either inside the agency or embedded assumptions and equities inside the way Hill staffers think about things, and the way we approach the law. And a lot of that was amplified by the industry associations and lobbyists who might have certain interests in the way the law evolved and the outcomes. And that's not to say that I don't have particular interests related to our company, but I was fascinated by how so many things that as an academic I understood abstractly really presented themselves in very stark terms when entering a heavily regulated industry. So we formed a merry band of experts, and three of them are here today. We've got a much deeper working group focused on this, and we're excited to talk about emerging tech in transportation, largely because in transportation, 8-10 years ago, transportation, DOT wasn't the hot agency to go to, but now there are people who have an innovation package at DOT. There are appointees who work on autonomous cars and supersonic flight and drones and artificial intelligence and smart cities and IoT at DOT. It's a hot place to be, and it's because technology is now allowing us to save lives in transportation and become more efficient as a society. And so that's why we really wanted our kickoff event to touch on emerging technology in transportation. So with that long wind up out of the way, let me sort of introduce my co-panelists and then we'll start with some framing questions and get into some specifics. And so to my immediate right is Ryan Hageman. Ryan is now the Senior Director for Policy at the Niskanen Center. He focuses on regulatory governance of emerging technologies. He has a long bio. I'm not going to go completely into it. Everybody's going to get a sentence. And as the moderator, I gave myself like 4 paragraphs, and that's just how I roll. Chris Koopman, so jumping all the way to my right, your left, is the Senior Director of Strategy and Research at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. He literally moved there 2 days ago. His stuff is still in a moving van. He left his family at home and flew all the way back here this morning for us. So winner, winner, chicken dinner.
That's how much I care.
That's how much he cares about prosperity and the American dream. Brent just drove around the corner. So Brent's the Senior Research Fellow in the Technology Policy Program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason. His research areas include wireless policy, new media regulation, telecommunications, and driverless cars. And so, all right, here's how I want to start things off. We're going to start abstract. And I'll just go from right to left, and this will be hopefully the thing that I always felt like I was missing. And the thing that when I talk to my students, I say, when you're looking at a new problem or a new issue, what's the framework that you're looking at it through? What's your lens? And so when we're talking about a new issue or a new technology, if I'm a Hill staffer, I'm right out of college, I'm meeting with someone for the first time in an association or a tech company, or maybe I'm someone dealing with a new issue in an agency, what should my analytical framework be like? What kind of questions should I be asking in the abstract in tech policy? As it applies to transportation? So not domain specific. Let's stay multimodal. How should I look at things? What's the right analytical approach?
Well, thanks. First off, thanks to the Federalist Society and to the Capitol Hill Club for hosting us here. Lovely venue. I think this is the best lunch I've ever had at one of these events. So, we're not going to feel bad if you guys continue to chomp away while we're up here talking. And of course, thanks to Devin and all of the other folks at the Federalist Society for, helping to organize this. It's great that we actually have a platform to talk about these important issues. So that's actually a rather serendipitous question that's being chucked my way, because I literally just got off a plane. I was at Arizona State University the last 2 days talking at the Governance of Emerging Technologies Symposium Forum, where the whole theme of the conference was soft law governance. So the short answer to Greg's question is soft law. Soft law, in my mind, is the way that you should be thinking about regulatory governance of emerging technologies. And that's for a couple of good reasons, but I think the most important one is what we can sum up as the pacing problem. So technology, especially over the last 20, 25 years, has advanced at an exponential rate in a way that we have not seen at any time before in human history. And perhaps unsurprisingly, and I hope all the lawyers in the room will agree with me on this, the law has not kept up with the state and the pace of technological change. And because the law hasn't kept up, neither have the regulators. So the pacing problem is basically the reference to this giant difference between where the technology is and how it's proceeding and progressing and how the law is proceeding. And it's a giant gap. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, given that we have a regulatory apparatus that was created for a different time and a different set of concerns, and frankly, a different era of technological progress and what was assumed to be the continuing rate of technological progress, how do we deal with that? So soft law in general refers to a set of systems and norms and sort of what some people might call kind of sub-regulatory guidance documents and things of that nature that make up a corpus of a set of systems that do not actually impose any sort of binding requirements on those that they are referencing. So, the short answer here is
so what's an example of that for someone who might not? I know what you're talking about, but maybe others don't. So what are some good examples of those?
Sure. I mean, well, there's probably way too many of them, quite frankly. But
just two.
All right, two. The first one would be pretty much any FDA guidance for industry document that is produced. These are guidance documents. They do not carry the force of law. They set expectations, and they can sort of cajole industry and firms to do something they might not otherwise have done, but they don't actually have the weight of the courts behind them, and for the most part, they're not subject to judicial review. So, I could literally talk all day about this and give you all sorts of examples of, the costs and benefits associated with this. But I think the FDA and its entire corpus of guidance documents it's produced over the last 110 years of its existence in various forms is probably like the picture perfect example of how this actually operates in practice.
And how about a non-government example? Because we all hate government and agency guidance.
A necessary evil. So perfect example of soft law mechanisms at work, sort of like in the private sector, would be kind of third-party standard-setting organizations, right? So industry gets together, they set up a group that is intended to create a set of standards, best practices, non-binding voluntary, voluntary standards, and the firms within that industry hold themselves accountable to ensuring that those standards are what they bake into the products that they're making, right? And for the most part, no, they're not, enforceable on face value. But there's always the stalking horse, the sword of Damocles of the regulatory state that is forever being held over their head, right? So if I'm a firm and I, say that I am going to abide by a certain set of, say, privacy standards, I've been certified perhaps by a third-party standard-setting organization that I am abiding by those best practices. But then it turns out I'm actually not doing that, and someone calls me out on it, consumer watchdog group, or perhaps a trial lawyer, whoever it might be. All of a sudden, I'm thinking to myself, "Oh boy, I could potentially be subject to some sort of FTC enforcement action against me now." So it's this ever-present threat of something happening, but the entire push here is that it's led by industry. It's led by maybe co-regulatory efforts with other agencies, but it's not dictated formally by government.
Before I go to Brent, let me just add an example of how this works in the FAA context. And so I chaired a ANSI accredited standards group out of the Consumer Technology Association. It was called R6 Working Group 23. There are other ones. There's ASTM, RTCA, and other industry standards groups. The immediate reaction I think that some might have is that, industry standards groups, that sounds like industry is writing the rules for themselves. On every one of our phone calls, FAA was participating. They were offering insights. They were telling us what would work within that standard and what wouldn't, because ultimately, once the standard was promulgated, for it to actually open airspace, or in this instance, be usable by the industry for something, the administrator of the FAA would have to state that that was a standard that was deemed acceptable to the administrator to meet their policy goals. And there's a separate executive order. So if you're a staffer on this, you can pull the executive order on, basically it's a directive to agencies to rely on industry standards when possible. The thing that the agencies oftentimes need is a nudge to direct them to create to get together with standards bodies and actually do something by a date certain. Otherwise, they might not do it. So go ahead, Brent.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Greg, and Pete, and Devin for having me. So the prism through which I approach these issues is what's called permissionless innovation. And my colleague Adam Thier, who I think many of us know, didn't coin the term, but he's written the book on this and lists some of these factors. I think the most pertinent ones are this idea that the burden should be on the government, not on innovators. Innovators should be given benefit of the doubt. And if you're a lawyer, you know burden shifting is everything. And so innovators should be given benefit of the doubt. The other one is a recognition. This is now Wild West, particularly in transportation. There's a lot of existing law out there, and we should rely on that, the common law and existing law, as much as possible before throwing up new regulations for some anticipated problem. And this idea of permissionless innovation comes from internet policy, actually. And so in the 90s, I think might have been the first time where Congress and lawmakers really dealt with this pacing problem. They realized this new technology, the internet, they just can't keep up with. And so there was an intentional policy of the United States in the 96 Telecom Act. Republican Congress, Bill Clinton, passed a law saying that it's U.S. policy that the internet and internet services should be unfettered by federal and state regulation. And that's been the de facto policy ever since. And so that's where that policy, that permissionless innovation framework comes from. And I think it's applicable to other areas where now information technology, so tech used to be information technology and media to a certain extent, but now it's getting into transportation, into healthcare, into retail. And I think because of this pacing problem and because of success, the policy success that we've had with the internet, I mean, the U.S. is a global leader in tech and the app economy, and $1 trillion of telecom investment since that time, and it's been a recipe for success. And so for me, that's the North Star, and that's how I approach these issues.
Great, thanks. When we get to problems, I'll have our problems section after our framework section. I'll have some questions along these lines for both of you. So Chris, go ahead with your framework.
Yeah, sure. And once again, just to echo everyone else on the panel, thank you so much to Federalist Society for hosting this, and all of you for coming on a rainy day to hear us talk. So I think just to build off of, in particular, what Brent said, is I think as policymakers, oftentimes, talking about permissionless innovation is all well and good, and then someone tells you that, robots are going to kill us all, or drones are going to crash into crowded stadiums, or all of these things, and you hear these techno-panic stories that make you think, well, okay, permissionless innovation is fine for Twitter, maybe not so much for aviation or some other area. So I think taking sort of the idea of permissionless innovation off of the internet as a platform for innovation and putting it into the real world, I think there are two things in particular to keep in mind here. The first one being separate fears from harm, right? Oftentimes in emerging tech, it doesn't take long for someone to construct a story of how this is going to destroy the world or our jobs or make us all worse off. And it becomes really easy to use those fears as an impetus for doing something. And I think separating that from actual tangible harm, right? The idea of, permissionless innovation does not mean unregulated. It means smarter, better regulations. So focusing on harms, tangible harms that are immediate and irreversible, right? When you start to look at problems that way, you start to be able to give innovators and entrepreneurs and entire industries enough breathing room to grow and develop, recognizing that experimentation means that things will go wrong sometimes, right? Trial also means trial and error, and allowing the market process to proceed. So then that's the first step, separating harm from fear. And then when you do step in a regulatory or creating a legal framework around a particular set of innovations or an industry, focusing on clear, concise, predictable language, right? This is probably nothing you all haven't all thought about before, right? This is sort of Epstein's idea of simple rules for a complex world. And I think that's what's really important for innovators and for innovation, is to be able to know that there are clear, simple rules that they can build their platforms around, they can build an entire world around, knowing that there isn't a difference of opinion about what this comma means or a semicolon here or there, that all of a sudden they've built an entire product and poured their lives into it, only to find out that a guidance document undoes it all in 450 words, right? So I think focusing on clear, concise, predictable regulations provides that framework for those, as Devin said, for those babies to grow in a way that they will trip and fall as they learn how to walk. And we allow that to happen because that's the only way to allow these sort of nascent industries to mature and create the type of economic benefits that we've seen from the internet over the last 25 years, right? Flipping the switch from no commercial activity in 1989 to commercial activity in 1990, and then allowing that to flourish on the internet. And now as software continues to eat the world, as they say, and more of these issues become tech issues, taking that same sort of light touch approach, I think is extremely important and is a framework that can allow for for regulators and policymakers to provide solutions to real problems without overstepping or getting out in front of our skis before an industry has an opportunity to actually correct what may just be frictions rather than market failures per se.
Great. So to kind of summarize, we have an idea here of maybe when staffers are working on this, or when you're advocating for something, what's in your toolbox. One of the first things that can be in your toolbox is a directive or a request to rely on industry consensus standards when possible. There was a piece of legislation on the Hill last year that actually wanted to direct DOT to scrub all of its regulations to find where those regulations could otherwise be replaced by industry consensus standards. It didn't go anywhere, but I thought it was a pretty good idea, basically trying to codify the old Reagan executive order on reliance on industry consensus standards. So we have that as a concept. Then the concept of permissionless innovation. How do we actualize that? We start first by saying, does the government need to actually do something here yet? Right. So this is really taking your 2 points combined. Is there a demonstrable harm? Have we proven that there's a harm, or are we just looking at some off chance that there might be some threat? And are we looking at anecdotal data and not actually looking at real harms? And so as we work through this, and then of course the clarity and regulations, I want to transition the panel to talking about domain-specific problems and examples. And with that, you could also talk about some potential solutions to those domain-specific problems. And I'll start with some from my own domain. So one of the earliest pieces of UAS-related legislation, the one that really kicked everything off for us, was the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012, basically Congress directing the FAA to integrate unmanned aircraft into the national airspace system. It took from 2012 to about 2015 to actually get regulations. And in that interim period of time, the FAA determined that unmanned aircraft were all aircraft. Drones were all aircraft subject to FAA regulation, irrespective of the size of the unmanned aircraft. And so the case was about a 2-pound foam, what we would otherwise call model airplane, but now it has the term drone. That's the new term of art we use. But they've claimed regulatory authority over everything that flies, all the way down to the smallest toy that you would buy in a toy store that would fit in your hand. And so that small toy that would fit in your hand, it might not need to be registered, but it's not outside of the scope of their regulatory authority because it's a device capable of flying, is treated in the same regulatory category as a 55-pound drone. That's the category of small unmanned aircraft. And with that, what does the agency do? Because the directive was broad, rather than calling out that specific categories perhaps should be treated differently, the agency claimed all of the authority that it could possibly have under the statute, and has authority and is treating almost all of those unmanned aircraft identically. Now, we're in 2018, so 6 years in, we're seeing the possibility of perhaps changing, but it was 2015 or 16 when I was testifying before Congress saying that we probably need a micro UAS rule that treats this category of small drones differently, because the equipage necessary on a 55-pound drone should be very different. So that's one example of something where a broad mandate that didn't rely on industry consensus standards, that assumed harm up front, assumes harm from the smallest drone all the way up to the largest, and the agency does not have an incentive to derogate from that. Right? The safest. Someone at the FAA told me when I went in to talk to them about innovative approaches to unmanned aircraft. And I've had hundreds of meetings at the FAA. He looked at me and he said, "Do you know what the safest day in American aviation was?" I said, "No." He said, "September 12th, because there wasn't a single plane flying in the air." He said, I don't get promoted by putting dangerous aircraft in the air. I get promoted by making sure that there are no accidents. And so putting more drones in the air raises a risk that I might have accidents happen." And I thought to myself, wow, that is a perspective, and like you can't be mad at the spider, right? I mean, the spider is what it is, and it's going to eat something, and that's just, how the spider is. But you should know that that's what's going to happen. And the second example I want to provide is one of the assumption here in in DC that I found that was shocking to me is that many on the Hill believe that they are not technically competent enough to handle an issue, and therefore they have to turn it over to the experts in the agencies. On emerging technology, the idea that the experts reside in the agencies is an idea that I would challenge. We went in to talk to the agency about safe ways to let the agency, the FAA, know about where unmanned aircraft were operating in proximity to airports, in the same way that you can hail an Uber by pushing a button on your phone and the Uber driver knows where you are. We explained that you could do the same thing with drones. We had deployed it to hundreds of airports, and the person at the FAA told me, well, we don't really know how to do that. Our plan right now is to create a call center on an existing flight services station contract, which is like a 8-year, $8 billion contract where people would call by telephone to say where they were operating at. And we were just sort of shocked in those conversations to hear that that was the approach. But the people they were talking to were the inside the Beltway companies who have an interest in perpetuating that 8-year, $8 billion contract. And so I have a strong sense that by not empowering the agency, unless the agency is precluding things from happening, you really are allowing ideas to flourish. And then a related point to that is that that I actually believe that here in DC we don't give enough credit to the states. I think the states do crazy things, like California, for example, does a lot of very restrictive things on emerging technology. But when they did restrictive things with autonomous vehicles, Arizona and Nevada and Ohio said, bring your autonomous vehicles to our state. And I think that interstate competition gets us to the right result more quickly. And I can point to dozens of examples of bad state laws, but I can also point to many examples of bad state laws that are capable of being remedied the next time around. And I think industry associations, the companies, and then those that come to have audience with staffers here on the Hill really should focus more on solving problems that you believe are of national significance by going to the states and getting harmonized national solutions, as opposed to trying to federally preempt it and create a federal problem in a federal agency around it, because I have not seen good outcomes with that approach for innovation, maybe good outcomes for certain companies. And so those are some drone-specific examples. And one way of thinking about this, there's a role for preemption. It's just not a role in all circumstances. And I think we need to be more nuanced about how we let the innovation flourish. And so maybe I'll start with Brent now on some of your domain-specific examples. I know you want to talk about autonomous cars and autonomous flying cars, and so VTOLs. Kind of give us some thoughts on how the approach is falling apart, or what we need to be doing to empower that technology.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been somewhat encouraged when it comes to self-driving cars. Government has been fairly accommodating, with the exception of California and some other examples. But in Virginia, where I live and work, Governor McAuliffe last year boasted, he's a Democrat, by the way, boasted they have no regulations about self-driving cars and invited companies to come in. And so, this is pretty common. And I think self-driving cars are kind of a special case, because just the road deaths annually, 40,000 last year, I believe, 1 million serious injuries. People know there's a public health crisis, and self-driving cars in our lifetimes will be part of the solution to bring those numbers down rapidly. So I've been somewhat encouraged on self-driving cars.
So what do you say to someone who hears exactly what you said and says, but wait, you're encouraged, but California is this huge state and they're throwing up all kinds of barriers. New York requires one hand on the wheel. You got another state that doesn't have any regulations. That sounds like a patchwork to me that the federal government needs to solve. So is it a patchwork, or is it a New York, California problem that needs to be fixed in New York and California?
So I think it depends what layer you're looking at. And I think in time, it'll become clear that the federal government handles kind of manufacturing and what cars look like and this sort of thing, as they traditionally have. And states will have their traditional roles in infrastructure and liability rules and this sort of thing. So I think it depends, but I think we will have a decent equilibrium in time, and it's already heading that way. There's some legislation out there. And I'll point out, there is existing law. I mean, kind of like the internet, we didn't have much regulation, and people, I'm sure, were worried at the time. But what you saw was we have laws about defamation and consumer fraud, and consumer deception, and these were all used. And I think you'll see that with you're already seeing this with self-driving car issues, where there have been some collisions. We're going to products liability law; it's already there, or negligence law in one case. So.
And how do those issues that you're talking about begin to map onto the flying car space? Because now we're dealing with something that, major safety issues. Traditionally, safety managed by the FAA claims repeatedly we have the safest aviation system in the world, but now you have aircraft carrying people landing in populated areas, not in unpopulated areas. The equities seem to still exist on the safety side, but now you have additional challenges at the state and local side.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are realities with flying cars, and for those who aren't familiar, it goes by various names: VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing, air taxis, this sort of thing. Last week I attended the second annual Uber Elevate Summit. Uber's the big promoter, kind of spearheading this technology, but they and their industry partners have big plans for air taxis in the Los Angeles area alone. Uber's interesting because they have tremendous amounts of transportation data and consumer data, and by using their data, in LA alone, they estimate that if you could have a reasonably affordable flying taxi, there would be millions of flights daily in Los Angeles alone, and it's pretty remarkable. I mean, there's a long ways to get to that affordable cost, but with battery technology improving, and they believe with autonomy, where you can eventually remove the pilot from these flying vehicles, you can get the cost down fairly low. It's an exciting idea. This idea we could go from Union Station to Dulles in 20-minute flight, and is pretty compelling. And
so let's then apply the framework now and kind of do the solution. What is government doing wrong in regulating this? What should government do? You said permissionless before. So if we have to wait till the harm happens, do we have to wait till the flying car falls out of the sky or starts to create noise issues flying by buildings? So this is, it was coming, right? The hard challenge to the permissionless framework. And so what do we do about those objections, which are less prospective than other types of objections we might have seen in the internet space?
Similar to self-driving cars in some ways, this is a very regulated area, and I think a lot of it, similar to self-driving cars, will be regulators peeling back regulations that don't make sense. And it should be said at this conference, a lot of these ideas about VTOL are coming from government agencies, and NASA and FAA in particular are working on these. They're often in partnership, and so they recognize kind of disruptive, in a good way, disruptive power of these technologies. And we'll see, but I think a lot of it will be removing regulations that don't make sense. When you have a technology shock like this, you're going to see they're going to run up into regulations. And I think the permissionless innovation will be repealing old rules that no longer make sense. And I think this, on the regulatory side, maybe on the, positive regulatory side, you're going to see disputes about airspace at the local level, but also with federal airspace. Drones, might be below 100 feet typically, but these VTOLs will be between under 2,000 feet or up to 2,000 feet or so, and that's regulated airspace. And we're going to see new conflicts, interesting conflicts, and some of my current research is just about property institutions and how do we dispose of what is a federal asset essentially, which is airspace.
So is the do no harm approach here then for staffers to direct the agency to accelerate the timelines for making the outcome happen, and really otherwise in this space, because it's already heavily regulated, trusting that the only way that it will happen is by a date certain by which a rule is published? Or
I think for staffers and policymakers, I think a lot of it will just similar to self-driving cars. I keep bringing it up, but it's consultation with the industry. What's happening? What does this look like? And with self-driving cars, it does seem regulators are fairly accommodating, and I expect we'll see more of that. I think regulators do understand they do have a pacing problem, and there are examples where they might not, but I hope that will continue, and I hope they'll look at be in consultation with the industry and see which legacy rules are staying in the way.
Great. So 1:05 now. We're gonna have 5 minutes now from Chris, and then 5 minutes from Ryan, and then we're gonna have time for Q&A. So I know some people might have Q&A. So let's go from 0 to 2,000 feet to sort of. It's technically 500 and above for GA, and then maybe we'll talk about some booms. So some supersonic flights. So Chris, give us some examples from things you're working on.
Yeah, so I think there are two examples I want to talk about: supersonic flight and flight sharing, and I think both of them are examples of the stuff I was talking about before. This idea of differentiating fears from harm, but then also writing clear, concise, predictable rules that innovators can build and innovate around. So I think this idea of differentiating fears from harm, right? What should we be regulating? What we should have regulated 50 years ago, but it doesn't make sense anymore, right? So in this space, and this is supersonic flight, right? In particular, the noise, the boom standards, right? So I know there are a few of you in this room that follow this very closely, but for the rest of you, in 1973, the FAA banned overland supersonic flight, right? They basically said no more, right? This is the result of a number of considerations on the part of the FAA. First of them being environmental impacts. And the second one being the air pollution or the noise pollution, right? So you have air pollution, noise pollution, right? Both of these being, fear-based regulations. It was pretty clear initially, any study that was done, that while there were environmental impacts, in particular the air pollution, they were a bit overblown, and over time to the noise pollution, it's pretty clear that innovation has gotten those booms down to a point where they aren't blasting out windows or these types of fears that people had 30, 40, 50 years ago. We've come a long way, and yet our regulations have stayed in place since 1973, have not budged one bit, has not moved. We've come a long way since then, and it turns out in terms of flying speeds, we're actually, we haven't gotten faster, and taking into account the Concorde, we're actually slower than we were in the 1960s. I think that's a disappointing story for air transportation. The other one, and this is writing clear, concise rules that innovators can build around. This is the story of flight sharing. So I don't know if there are any general aviation pilots in the room or out there in the internet world watching right now. But for most people, general aviation is an expensive hobby, right? You think like someone who flies around 100 hours. A month or so, or a year, it comes out to about like $200 an hour to fly an airplane. That's expensive. Like most of us maybe some people in here do, but most people in the world.
Some people are billing right now for a lot more than that.
Exactly, right? But for the rest of us, right? The rest of us.
And the Federalist Society accepts donations, those people. And so Madison Club, check it out. It's good. You get a little badge for the Lawyers Convention.
Yeah, but takeoff, landing fees, maintenance, fuel, all these costs that come along with flying, let's say just the Cessna, right? On a sunny day, maybe in Northern Virginia, you might see one of these flying around, right? That's expensive to operate for a hobbyist, right? And there are all of these regulations to stay current. You have to have so many takeoff and landings on a regular basis to stay up with the regulatory framework. So a practice emerged as long as general aviation has been around. There's been this practice among pilots and passengers to cost share, right? To find 4 people or so that all want to go up in the air. Maybe we're heading in the same direction, and so not making money. The pilot is not making money, but the FAA has recognized this as a private right of pilots to share the pro rata costs of of operating that airplane, right? The way this practice has been done for decades has been corkboards in airports all around the country, right? So you imagine this practice of, let's say you want to go up into an airplane, right? And you want to go up on Saturday, tomorrow, right? You have to drive out to maybe Leesburg or somewhere, look on a corkboard, see if there's someone who's going up, right? You know, contact them, you know, like the little tearaways, like the Rent Here sort of thing, right? Go home.
Cat.
Yeah, right. You think, you know, I could go on, you call them, they say I'm leaving at noon, maybe they, you know, they're not leaving. This whole process back and forth, inefficient. This is like ripe for the types of like technological disruption that platforms bring, right? Think Uber for airplanes in a slightly different context. In that, innovators came up with an idea. Why don't we take these physical corkboards and put them on your smartphones, right? Just digital corkboards where you can now very efficiently connect with others, right? If you're a pilot, you can find passengers quickly. If you're a passenger, you can find pilots, right? Very simple idea. The problem being, when Congress was passing the Federal Aviation Act, they never defined the term common carrier, right? They have other definitions that use the term common carrier, but never defined common carrier, and more or less left it to the FAA to define and redefine on a very ad hoc basis over the last 40 years. The FAA has been doing this through opinion letters, soft law guidance documents, types of things. So imagine, like for example, you're posting this on Facebook to your network, and you want to know, am I violating federal law? Right? It's really difficult to know that up front. There's no rule that tells you whether or not posting a flight on your Facebook feed is a violation of federal law. So maybe you might hire a lawyer or send a request to the FAA, and they would come back with an opinion, and they have done this, that says, well, it depends. How big is your network? Why are people reading your post? Right? How did you connect with them? How did you follow up with all this fact-specific stuff that, in essence, no one was posting on social media really anymore, and the platforms themselves were ultimately shut down. Right? These platforms I mentioned before that said this is a great way to make the world more efficient and better and connect people. Right? As Greg said, I just moved to Utah. I moved to Logan, Utah. Right? I'm an hour north of the Salt Lake City airport, and it's really the only commercial airport that I can get to in any reasonable amount of time. And yet there is the Cache Valley Airport 5 minutes from my house. I would love to be able to find pilots that would fly me around when I need to go places instead of driving 3.5, 4 hours before my flight to get down, park at the park and jet, get on the bus, drive, this whole process, right? You can make this very, very smooth for, massive amounts of people living in rural America. And yet the FAA has more or less taken the flexibility given by Congress's inability to define the term and has just shut down this nascent innovation, which I think, to a point you were saying before about sort of innovation arbitrage between states, right? That every bad decision California makes, Governor Ducey in Arizona is just waving people along, right? And there's this is happening all over the place. It happens at a global level too, and this is something a colleague of mine, Adam Thier, has talked about, is global innovation arbitrage. Flight sharing is happening and thriving in Europe. Right, the European Aviation Safety Administration has embraced this and has played an active role in sort of this soft law stuff that Ryan has talked about in setting standards and best practices and being a partner with the industry, saying, okay, people have fears and concerns. How can we address those and still allow for innovation and the market to continue to grow? And so you're seeing this. I mean, we have tens of thousands of people connecting in Europe right now. And it's illegal to do so in the United States. But you're also seeing this in drones and other innovators as well that are moving to Australia. They're moving to Europe. They're going elsewhere because federal policy in the United States has shut a lot of these nascent industries down.
So I think an important point there and is to recognize that so we have an example. We have a video on this flight sharing issue, and you can see the concrete impact it had on one particular business. And so it's on the RTP website, and you should check it out. It's called the Flight Now video. If you just look for that on YouTube, you'll find it. And Flight Now was a company that was about to raise capital. They had an advisory letter. They relied on a prior advisory letter of the FAA. So this is regulation by government fiat stemming from an ambiguous statute, and then regulatory interpretations. They spent 6 to 9 months building their business, taking time away from their jobs, putting their own money into it. And then on the eve of what's known as Y Combinator's startup pitch day, where they were to pitch hundreds of venture capitalists to invest in their company, where they thought they had a big business ready to go, they received the letter from the FAA telling them that they were a common carrier, an air carrier, and they had to meet all of the same statutory requirements that Delta or American Airlines would have to meet when they were just a mobile platform. So you should look at that video to try and understand, and then aggregate that type of impact on that one business across many businesses that are going to Australia, going to Europe. My own business took R&D we did in the United States, and we went to Switzerland to deploy. We went to Japan. We have a deployment in New Zealand. So there is a big impact there. I have to wrap this, Chris, so we can go to Ryan, then we'll go to Q&A. But we can talk more about this in the Q&A. So let's talk about examples. We've gone from low altitude airspace to upper altitude airspace to GA to let's talk autonomous vehicles and the types of problems we're seeing now and potential solutions.
Yeah, sure. So let's come all the way back to the ground.
Bring it to the ground.
Right. And I guess I'll try to rope in a lot of what both Chris and Brent have been talking about here with a very specific regulatory example around the introduction of autonomous vehicles onto American roadways. So if you look at federal statute, there is nothing present anywhere that stipulates that autonomous vehicles are illegal. Rather, there are a lot of weird statutes that may implicate the idea that only humans could drive cars, but we're not really sure. So to go to Chris's point about this need for sort of clarity of rules, for a certain level of market certainty for folks looking to invest in this space, it would seem like there is certainty about what is actually permitted, but in fact there isn't. And on the global innovation arbitrage point, it actually works both ways too. So this past week, some of you might have seen that the new Audi A8, the 2019 version, actually has a fully operational, commercializable SAE Level 3 autopilot feature for their vehicles. And they are going to be rolling those out, no pun intended, in Germany early next year. And they will not be rolling them out here in the United States. And when asked why that was the case, Audi's response was, well, we took a look at the statutes. And like Ryan just said, they didn't say that, but like Ryan just said, it seems as though this would be legal, but we're not actually sure. And it doesn't seem like your house is fully in order. And we here in Germany passed a law that specifically legalized SAE Level 3 automation in our vehicles last year. So you get the Audi A8, you just don't get the Level 3 autopilot feature. So kind of sucks for us, I guess, right? The trouble here is one of competing tensions, right? If you want to provide a level of market certainty that would potentially allow for that type of automation level to be deployed on American roadways, you run into the potential problem of legislators actually getting it wrong and going too far in the prescriptive direction. On the other hand, if we simply have sort of a Wild West permissionless innovation, anything goes landscape, people still aren't going to be deploying commercializable technology because of the existence of the bureaucratic state. Again, that sword of Damocles hangs forever over everyone's head. So what we're left with is we kind of have to figure out a way to muddle through all of this. And one of the ways the DOT is currently doing this is by asking for public input on specific federal motor vehicle safety standards that could potentially conflict with automated vehicles. And if you're ever looking to woo yourself to sleep, I suggest going through the many hundreds of pages that we have on the FMVSSs, which regulate everything from the location of specific stickers on the sides of rear view mirrors to the specific amount of Newtonian force that can be applied based on where an individual is sitting in the vehicle. The entire scope of these regulations could potentially conflict with any automated vehicle that's deployed on American roadways because they all assume one important fact through and through. There is a human operator of the vehicle. The seats are all facing the same direction. And that seems like a reasonable way to craft an FMVSS if you're doing it up until about 10 years ago, right? Because the assumption is, here's how the technology works. It's a car, people drive it, that's kind of that. So part of the way we try to get to a place where we have great market certainty, but we also take into account the political and the regulatory realities that we deal with is we improve things on the margins, we get rid of those regulatory measures that don't seem to make sense, or we exempt new vehicles from complying with some of those regulatory measures. And we also try to provide a certain sense of market certainty at a higher level through, and I'm gonna, Brent and I may disagree on this. I am actually a fan of federal preemption on manufacture and design of autonomous vehicles for safety purposes. I think that the AV START Act gets that right. I think federal preemption does make sense. And
I think we're agreed on that.
Oh, we are? Okay, great. Beautiful.
Boring.
Yeah, right. And the key here is these all seem reasonable to me because what we're not trying to do is try to regulate the driver of the autonomous vehicle. We are not trying to regulate the algorithm at this point. And I think that attempting to embark on that journey is something of a fool's errand right now, because as Greg was saying from the get-go, the expertise just isn't there. It's not there in Congress to draft rules that would actually narrowly tailor rules to autonomous vehicles in particular. You can define algorithm in any number of ways that would implicate not just autonomous vehicles, but things like Google search, right? Like Siri on our phones. The thing is, algorithm is a very broad term and can, rope in all sorts of industries that you don't intend it to if you try to regulate it. And that's sort of the one outstanding issue in the autonomous vehicle space right now is, okay, we can have manufacturing design standards. DOT has plenty of safety authority to sort of regulate on that front, and we can get rid of some of the FMVSSs. Like we can improve things on the margin, but the core concern I think that goes with autonomous vehicles is it's not a person driving it. How do we regulate that? That's entirely unclear. And I think that's actually a perfect case study for how you can actually use soft law and multi-stakeholder governance proceedings to get industry and other actors and stakeholders to a set of very base, loose-line standards that can evolve over time. They can be flexible, and they can be adaptive to changing realities in the technology without being so overly prescriptive that you achieve a level of market certainty where everyone is clear on what the rules are. And the clarity tells you that nothing is allowed on the roadways that doesn't have a human operator behind the wheel of the vehicle.
All right, thanks to everyone. So one theme I want to note as we go to Q&A is really one of the things that those drafting laws should remain aware of, and those working on the Hill should remain aware of, is this definitional issue, right? Remember I gave you the example of the small drone that you could hold in your hand. How did that become subject to, so there was an exemption from FAA regulations that was filed because a person had a remote controlled paper airplane, and because it was a device capable of flight, it was an aircraft, and therefore it had to be waived under the 333 exemptions that Congress allowed for in the 2012 FAA Reauthorization Act. It had to be waived from existing FAA regulations governing aircraft. For example, the requirement that there be seat belts on board and an operator's manual in the cockpit. Now, those regulations applied to that aircraft just as much as they applied to the 55-pound drone, because the agency decided these were aircraft. The agency looked and has a definition for airports. And airports are any location designated for takeoff and landing. And so unmanned aircraft were not allowed to operate within 5 miles of an airport. That's every helipad in Los Angeles, whether it's operational or not, because almost all the helipads in Los Angeles are non-operational. Farmers' fields, there were used car lots showing up with airports on them because one day they wanted to land a helicopter there as Santa would jump out as part of a promotion, and they never took themselves out of the airport database. You have You have ambiguous definitions of common carriers. You have a default that says, oh, driverless cars, they're cars. We'll just leave that alone. And so sometimes tightening the definition for the new category, that alone, asking the agency to recognize this as a unique category and identify the regulations that should not apply, might be an action that could be taken to proactively prevent the agency from taking a broad perspective and saying, we're about safety, we must do something, and if we don't do something here, people may die. Therefore, hold on to that power because we don't want to be left holding the bag if something happens and the question comes up, why didn't you do something about this? Even if it's as dumb as requiring people to have a hand on the wheel in an automobile that doesn't have a wheel, like doesn't have a steering wheel. Okay, so we have time for questions. We'll stay after. Go ahead, sir. There's like a power button you might have to hit, and then a green light goes on.
Hello? Okay. Building off the comments you just made, when the FAA designated drones as aircraft, it brought along a whole regulatory regime, one of them being federal preemption, and that got in the way of cities trying to regulate drone use in what they considered their airspace, even though it's federal airspace. So my question is there a role for states and local governments to regulate drones based on activities that have typically been regulated at the state and local level? Trespassing, stalking, peeping, whatever you want to say. Is there a place for them, or should anything related to drones come from the federal government so there's one standard?
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting question that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I don't subscribe to the view that the federal airspace belongs to the federal government, or that there's federal airspace. So the FAA has regulatory authority over aircraft, over airmen, and over aspects of airspace. But if you take a look at, for example, does the federal government have the ability to prohibit me from operating a drone 1 millimeter above land in my backyard? If your conclusion is that's federal airspace, and you say, and it's a federal highway through which all people have a right to transit, then if they can preclude me from operating it, and it's a federal highway, they also can allow anyone to operate there at any point in time 1 millimeter above my property. I think that raises property rights issues. I think it raises trespass issues. Another concrete example went in Santa Monica, where my company's headquarters is. There's a pedestrian walkway where skateboards, bicycles, and other devices are not permitted. And in the early days, before I had pushed back against this idea of federal preemption, I told a police officer that, well, you can't prohibit drones there because drones are regulated by the FAA. And he looked at me like I had 11 heads. And he said, so you mean to tell me that 1 inch above the ground where the skateboard is, if I put the drone on the ground, the city can prevent it. But the second it's 1 inch above the ground, and if it's 55 pounds with spinning blades, I'm not allowed to prevent that, but I can prevent the skateboard. And so I started looking into it. This is a question of the police power, right? And so I think what ends up happening is the closer you get to the ground, the more this technology resembles the equities that the states have to deal with, and by derivation, the cities, which could be preempted by states, but states are true entities under the Constitution. But I don't think the agency thought that through, right? They were thinking, when FIMRA 2012 was passed, they were thinking predators and reapers on the battlefield. Nobody had heard of a DJI drone. And when they started making their rules, you talk to people in the FAA, I meet people in the FAA all the time who are excited to fly a drone for the first time in the UAS integration office that's making the regulations governing drones. And so they have conceptions based on their experience with the legacy technology and the legacy rules, and their solutions flow from that. I think the better approach would be to recognize that when matters touch on issues that are core to the states and their ability to handle them, maybe we allow the states to participate in that. Maybe it's cooperative federalism, right? So it's preempted, but with participation from the states. But if you don't give them a voice, I think the industry never takes off.
But on that, I think this area, tentatively, I think if there were a demarcation point of airspace, which is federal and local, I think that might help. It gets very tricky. You have regulatory takings issues. You have local zoning issues. But the fact is, airspace is going to become increasingly more crowded. I mean, with drones already, but if VTOL becomes an actual mass market service, you're going to have tens of thousands of these things at low altitude, and a demarcation point between local control and federal control might be useful.
Other questions? If not, we'll just riff on that one for a while.
Yeah, I'll keep riffing on it because I think it opens the door to have a broader conversation about what drone operations might sort of like rope in with regards to federal action. Because right now I think you're hearing, well, I assume you're hearing, I'm certainly hearing, a lot of talk about how it's actually now apparently the job of the FAA to start regulating privacy issues as they relate to drones. That's not true. I mean, just statutorily, that's not what the FAA's mission is. It's to police airspace safety, and there are other issues that it deals with. But it is not a privacy regulator. We do not have a federal privacy regulator in this country. You can make an argument that the FTC sort of serves that function, basically by default. But the way we have always treated privacy concerns in this country is through sectoral-based regulations. Things like HIPAA and GINA in the healthcare space to deal with sensitive private information, COPA to deal with children's information online, financial sector-based regulations with regards to personally identifiable information. We don't have what the Europeans have in the GDPR and what they have had in previous iterations. And I think that's a good thing. When you try to impose some sort of one-size-fits-all privacy solution at the federal level, the number of issues that you run into are just absolutely mind-boggling. So I actually wrote a journal article on this recently, looking at commercial drones and privacy implications. There are four general torts as they relate to privacy in this country. You have things like intrusion upon seclusion, public light given to private facts, and when you start to think about how commercial operation of a drone might implicate those sorts of specific harms as they relate to an individual's privacy. And we're put aside the Fourth Amendment issues here and put aside even the First Amendment issues. And let's narrowly focus on I decide that I have a drone company, and what I want to do is I want to have a persistent set of sort of drones flying around in a populated area, and they're taking real-time mapping images of traffic as well as sidewalk traffic, right? So I'm looking at where everyone walking around in a public space is going all the time, right? It's persistent, right? Have I technically violated anyone's quote-unquote right to privacy the way those four torts are currently constructed and the current tests used to make those determinations? I think it's kind of a tough sell that I am, depending on how the drones are being operated. It's all contextual, right? If I'm flying the drone, behind you and everyone else everywhere all the time, then you have a good argument to make that it's persistent and what's the you're the lawyer here, Greg. Remind me what the standard is for what is the standard here for it has to be persistent, but it's persistent observation, and what's the harm standard? Man, I wrote about this.
For publication of the private facts?
For intrusion upon seclusion.
Highly offensive to a reasonable person.
Thank you. Yes. Highly offensive to a reasonable person. If the drone is flying right around you constantly and it's persistent all the time whenever you're out in public, you have, I think, a pretty solid claim to make. What if the drone is flying, say, 500 feet above the air and 500 feet above the ground, and you can barely see it, you can't hear it, it's not really bothering you in any colloquial sense of the word, but it's up there and it's, potentially inadvertently scooping up information about your activities. What kind of privacy harms does that implicate? And the answer isn't clear.
Just to pull this into a broader point on your question, do you want the FAA or any government agency managing that fact-specific question, but let's take the privacy part out of it. A company wants to conduct delivery operations 24/7, and just think of where you grew up when you were young, right? I think of the town I grew up in New Jersey, and where I lived was like a regular street with houses kind of lined up, standard suburbia. But there was a part of town that was relatively industrial. I have no problem with drones taking off and landing 24/7 in that area, but if they're taking off landing 24/7 at 3 in the morning, delivering burritos to my neighbor's kid, when my son wouldn't sleep for 9 months after being born, and then the night she finally goes to sleep, then in comes the burrito delivery. I'm going to lose my mind, and I'm going to call my mayor. And if the mayor says to me, sorry, I can't do anything about it, call the governor, and then the governor says, call the FAA, like, which office would I call? And that's, the Township of Ocean in New Jersey issue, specific to the land use and zoning challenges of that township, multiplied across 10,000 different jurisdictions with different preferences, where Manhattan, Kansas is different than Manhattan, New York City. And it's basically the airport noise litigation challenges multiplied 100-fold by jurisdiction, multiplied 10,000-fold by the number of aircraft. We're talking about 1 million flights over Los Angeles. Google wants to do 75,000 daily delivery flights over Los Angeles. There should be uniformity and standards as to how that's adjudicated, but I think the people closest to the issue should be making the decision about it. And Berkeley, California wants to be crazy and ban drones. They won't get sticks of deodorant in 24 hours. They don't even use sticks of deodorant, so they'll just get it like by mail. But like in Palo Alto and Mountain View, people will get it, Amazon Prime within an hour. And I think ultimately we'll get to the right outcome. If the federal government runs it, I think we'll bobble around for 4 or 5 years until we finally realize we need to have the people be more involved. The data point that I'll end on here is that the FAA's put a couple 100,000 aircraft in the air, and that has worked for us for manned aircraft. That's in the history of the agency. Billions of automobile trips happen a day, and it's federally regulated on equipment. Standards are harmonized, but we trust the states to do time, manner, and place. And I want a drone economy that looks more like that than one that looks like a federally managed system with federal acquisitions that moves at the pace of 1970s government.
Agreed.
Last question.
Here we go. How would you foresee going then from the small 55-pound UAS to eventual large carrier operations that are going to have to be controlled by the FAA because you have passenger carry, and if you have a subset of state laws that are then saying this is my airspace, incorporated into that national infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the president's executive order creating the IPP program creates the first framework for this, and so it establishes that state, local, and tribal governments can establish reasonable time, manner, and place restrictions in airspace essentially below 200 feet. And so that framework will then allow for some standardization about how the information, what types of rules could be made that are deemed reasonable. And remember, it's still preempted, right? It's just a delegation, and so it's not the anti-preemption thing that like in the Drone Federalism Act, like Senator Lee and Senator Feinstein had, but instead it's more of a cooperative federalism approach. And then the information would have to be input into a system, so that system would likely be UTM. We do that now near airports where certain areas are designated as safe for flight or not safe for flight, and eventually it's going to add time-based limitations or whether you have certain qualifications. And you could see doing that across the United States in a collaborative way where instead of the federal government trying to go around like what they're trying to do now, find every electrical substation in the United States, and there's one person, one contractor half-time in some FAA office whose job is to do that. Good luck. But if we go back to my hometown, there's someone in the mayor's office who knows where all of that is. Give them a system and standards, to feed that up. And so probably just like traffic lights are all standardized, but you can get them from different vendors. The systems would be standardized, provided by different vendors. The state and local governments could feed that information up. And I think that would then begin to apply to the air carrier type of operations where areas that might be zoned in certain ways, near bus stops, you're probably going to have the passenger aircraft the autonomous passenger aircraft landing in those areas, they'll be subject to state and local rules below a certain altitude, maybe 200 feet or within 200 feet laterally of a structure or people. And then when they get above that, they're in the equivalent of an interstate in the sky. And this allows us to avoid the property rights issues. It lets local governments do what they're best at, but also, allows us to achieve the benefits of the federal government's expertise in managing more integrated airspace. And so I think that's the way you do it, but what you do is you say, how do I engineer around this problem with technology? And then recognize that if I have a solution to engineer around it, I can create a policy framework that marries up with that. I think the one example I gave to someone who objected to this idea was like, how could anyone possibly be able to know and do all of this? And I said, I was in San Francisco and I held an Uber, and the app told me that I wasn't allowed to get the Uber on that street. I had to walk a block over because there was a city regulation that said I couldn't be there. And it was input into the system. And that's how that's known. I think as soon as we abstract from the legacy policy and say to ourselves, how do you get to a technology-based solution? I think that's how we move a lot more quickly. Devin, you want to add any final thoughts? Anyone from the panel? Final thoughts? No. So we did go over. I want to thank everyone for coming out. I want to thank everyone who attended online. My call to action for you is to follow the Regulatory Transparency Project on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Follow our podcast, the Free Lunch Podcast. If you're interested in these issues, you have a topic we should do a teleforum about, reach out to us. We really want to keep the conversation going about these types of things. And so thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks for your time.